Oh, G Rose, and today we're going to be talking about conspiracy and the subject, a Lacanian enterprise by Mr. Hunter Coates. Hunter Coates runs the YouTube channel Dissatisfied Philosophy, and I was very glad to see a work that's bringing Lacan and conspiracy together. I think the topic of conspiracy is extremely important. I've had a few conversations with Lorenzo about it. We talked about Pandora's rationality, and really we need to, in the same way that in Belonging Again, we tend to think of madness as the loss of rationality, when actually I think madness is an overabundance of rationality or autonomous rationality without a dialectical structure. Likewise, a conspiracy we tend to frame in society as irrational, as stupid, as something silly. But really, conspiracies, I would argue, is a logical structure that rationality leads into. Conspiracies are not something that more rationality will get you out of, but precisely something that rationality can lead you into. The great Thomas Pynchon in The Crying of Lot 49 is really good on this. You have Sassinsi Kohn, who did Paranoia Agent, Perfect Blue over in Japanese thought. He's a wonderful director, but we really need to think of conspiracy seriously and to really examine the structures according to which they operate and organize themselves and sustain themselves. And Mr. Hunter Coates has done a tremendous job of that analysis. So I'm very grateful for it, bringing together Lacan, conspiracies, Freud, Zizek, Hegel. I really appreciate what he's getting at. Some of the things that he talks about, Lacan has that idea that courtly dating is the recognition from a man that the woman must deny him immediate satisfaction so that they attain love. Well, conspiracies do something similar, right? They deny you the truth precisely so that you are committed to the truth. There's this strange double moves, and really to understand the conspiracy, we have to examine these paradoxical moves. Like there's a denial of truth, which is precisely the truth. The truth is you are denied truth. And so if you never obtain the truth, well, then that's actually evidence of the truth, right? You see there's a paradoxical move there that keeps you addicted, attached, if you will. And there is something about addicted in the language of drugs that seems useful here. And you see, there is, what's really important in Lacan is we get all of these ideas that humans can actually enjoy denial. Giazons, which I never say, and the great Matthew Stanley did a wonderful work on, is where we find enjoyment and denial. And there's this very important move in Lacan that Mr. Coates brings out where desire must be blocked from its end or else it cannot continue to fantasize, right? Because if you get what you want, you can't fantasize about it. And so desire actually seeks to self-sabotage itself or to not obtain its end or else it dies. So there's these very strange moves that desire engages in order to keep desiring. And the conspiracy in some respects is just simply a worldview that doesn't hide the operations of worldview following a Lacanian structure. Basically, all worldviews are what I call an internally consistent system. They are like a conspiracy. It's just that what we tend to call a conspiracy is a worldview that's Lacanian structure is undeniable to those, or less deniable to those outside the conspiracy, but of course vanishes as a conspiracy to those within it. Or those within the conspiracy do not use the term conspiracy as a simile for absurd, but a secret plot, which is more of the original understanding of conspiracy. I mean, that's the other problem. The word conspiracy is actually difficult to use now, because the moment I call something a conspiracy, that automatically discounts it in my mind. But really, there are true conspiracies. I talked with Lorenzo about this. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the Gulf of Tonkin, I can keep going. Like, there are true conspiracies. A conspiracy is simply a plot, an undercover plot. But now conspiracy has become a slur term, so it's very difficult to use. Because people who believe in a conspiracy don't experience it as a quote-unquote experiency. They experience it as the truth. So there's something about a conspiracy that can actually help us understand the structure of all worldviews if we look at it clearly. And there are mechanisms of the conspiracy that basically make it invincible. You just have to leave it event. And this gets into the whole, what I'll talk about, the map is indestructible. But the examination of the conspiracy can really bring out these very problematic dynamics and also go to show you why autonomous rationality or pure A is A logic is very problematic because it can't get you out of a conspiracy. All it can do is reify, restate, or re-explore the internal consistency that keeps you in the labyrinth, per se. And what Mr. Hunter has done here in bringing Lacan into the conversation is really show how we enjoy that problem. We enjoy being stuck in something. Because if we're stuck in something, we can always desire. If we are stuck in the blockade, then the fantasy lives forever. Because there's no possibility of the desire overcoming the blockade, and therefore finding out that it's groundless. There is no big other, right? And then you get all that language that Mr. Hunter does a great job on. So, in some respects, a conspiracy is the masterpiece of enjoyment. It's like a dream come true for desire, because you can't escape it. And so naturally, all desire wants to make all worldviews internally consistent and a conspiracy, because then it never has to worry about reaching its object, and the desire is infinite. It will never die. A conspiracy, what we tend to socially call a conspiracy, is simply a worldview that can't hide its mechanisms of self-entrapment or self-enclosure or internal consistency. Like, the jig is up. We see it as what we see in a conspiracy is what all worldviews do, but the mechanism has become more visible to most people. Not everyone, ergo the people in the conspiracy, but it's become more visible. But there's something perhaps one of the reasons we call a conspiracy as a slur term is precisely to other it. So it will not cause us the anxiety of realizing that all worldviews have the same structure, and therefore we might follow the same structure. So I think there's an othering of the concept of conspiracy precisely to hide us from the revelation of conspiracy as the structure of all worldviews. So we don't like that, so we kind of push it away. Now, the map is indestructible is going to be talking about that very much in terms of epistemology and ontology, but what Mr. Hunter has done here is there has to be a way to explain, though, why we like that, why we enjoy that. I mean, wouldn't you think that we would eventually, if desire never reaches its object, wouldn't you think that we eventually, give up the desire, or we hate it or something? Well, that's where bringing Lacan here is so genius, because this is where we get jouissance, the J word I can never say. We get the idea that we enjoy self-sabotage. We enjoy not reaching our end. And then we need the analysis of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real to understand how we stay in a conspiracy and how we desire to stay in them, all while we say that we don't desire to stay in them. How we enjoy being deceived, all while we say we don't enjoy being deceived. And Lacan is really necessary for understanding those dynamics, because if we don't understand desire, then we can have an epistemological structure of a quote-unquote, indestructible map, as I'll talk about with Kurt Gödel and all that. But that really won't provide the analysis of why we stay in that system. So what Mr. Coates has done here is very important. And I also really like where, in the paper on the book, I'll talk a lot about the capital D deception, kind of like God, right? Because there's also something about God and God being the quote-unquote big other that desire never fully accesses in this life. Well, you got to explain how we enjoy believing in a God we never fully access, and that's also what Lacan does. And it's isomorphic. It has a similar structure to the conspiracy, religion and conspiracy. Now, that doesn't mean religion is false in the same way that the fact a conspiracy is a conspiracy doesn't follow that it is necessarily false. But what we're trying to analyze is the similarity of structure. And in fact, the fact that conspiracies can be true is why they are so... Basically, there's no necessary reason ever to leave one. The map is indestructible. There's no necessary reason ever to leave a religion, because whatever point of incompletion one finds, or there are experiences here, there are martyrs, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, miracles, etc., so forth that people claim, there is always a point of which gives plausibility to the system that you ascribe to, which even if the system cannot fully justify itself, the lack of utter justification still has enough plausibility to not see that lack of completion as evidence that the system is false, because people claim to have miracles. You yourself have maybe never come back from the grave or experienced a miracle, but the fact, or martyred yourself, but the fact some people have provide evidence that the system can be believed in. Likewise, the fact that some conspiracies have turned out to be true provide evidence to believe that, well, this one might be true, like QAnon. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was true, so maybe QAnon is true, right? There's always reason to think that this is possible. Now, what's so fascinating about there's a real way in which, again, that the conspiracy is the masterpiece of desire, and it is it's a kind of masterpiece in the sense that a conspiracy says that the truth is deception. The truth is that you are being deceived. Well, that's unfalsifiable, right? I mean, the line that Mr. Hunter uses, he says, placing faith in the belief that the big other is all deceiving raises deception to the status of big other. So big other becomes deception. And the fact you don't know the truth is thus evidence of that truth. You see this kind of double move that occurs, which then provides an infinite source of enjoyment because you're infinitely being denied the thing always. And you see with that, you get that investigative drive is a phrase Mr. Hunter uses because you want to figure out the deception. But you see, it's very interesting here because if the investigation doesn't bear any fruit, then that's still evidence of the deception. Because the truth is deception. You haven't borne fruit, of course, because you're being deceived. You see how it facilitates itself. And it never goes away. Mr. Hunter also makes in Lacan, the difference between the other and the big other. He makes the example, there's the idea of the wife, and then the other with a lowercase o, and then wife with the big other, like the idea of being married, or the idea of final completion in marriage and love and so on and so forth. And really it's quite important that even if you don't have a wife, a lowercase o other, you can still be driven or think according to the capital W wife, the big other, and to organize your life accordingly. Likewise, even if a given conspiracy is proven to be false, or this conspiracy is absurd, it doesn't follow that all conspiracies are false. So likewise, if you have a bad marriage, that doesn't prove that there is no capital W wife out there. You might have just married the wrong lowercase w wife, right? Like the unveiling of the other as merely a lowercase o other does not overturn the big other. You just simply have to know that there is no big other. But if you don't know that, then you're in big trouble. Well, there can be trouble, right? So this is where, the conspiracies are indestructible. Like, even if you disprove one version of QAnon, another version of QAnon might be true. And precisely because some conspiracies in the past have been proven true, maybe this one will be. And it's also really interesting to note, the conspiracies that have been proven true, there's almost something boring about them. Or it's like, oh yeah, the CIA did this operation. Of course it did. In the same way that when it turns out that your idea of love or fame or, finding meaning or whatever, once you actually obtain that, it can be underwhelming if you're not ready for it. And this is where you can get mental illness or people really depressed because it turns out that it wasn't what you thought it was going to be. And so then you have to project again into a new fantasy, or learn to live integrated with the lack, as Cadell and Mr. Ebert and Tim and I talked about in that series. You either have to learn to live with this condition of things always having a certain incompleteness to them, or you end up always projecting a new fantasy, a new conspiracy, so on and so on, which you can always do, of course, because no lowercase o situation, other, deconstruction of a lowercase o other ever forces the deconstruction of the big other. You can always move the variables around. So Mr. Coates he has this part where indeed there was a great debate in Lacan what is meant by drive. Mr. Coates is going to say the drive is the subject's mechanism which provokes enjoyment through sacrifice. And this is also important. Like, when you seek a conspiracy, you might be rejected by your friends. No one may understand you. So there's this feeling of sacrifice where you're the one who gets the truth and you're rejected. But instead of experiencing or interpreting that rejection as evidence that you're wrong, you interpret it as evidence that you're right, or you enjoy that because now you're the lone person who knows the truth, or you interpret it as noble and you enjoy being noble. So there's a sacrifice there. So you see, this is why it's not necessarily going to work to overturn a conspiracy like QAnon by simply rejecting everyone who's part of QAnon, because they can find enjoyment in that rejection. And so that's a mistake, I think, sometimes in how people deals with conspiracies. And Mr. Hunter has this great line: incompletion is that which provokes enjoyment. We enjoy incompletion. And so what's so fascinating about the conspiracy is that it is by definition, as a capital D deception, big other deception, God, capital G God, deception, it is that of which is structurally incomplete. And so it's really invincible. Like, when you seek completion in a relationship presents itself as complete, right? So you expect it to be complete. So when it's not complete, you're disappointed. But a conspiracy presents itself as that always missing the truth. And so when the conspiracy is always missing the truth, you're not necessarily disappointed. This is why it's like, quote unquote, the masterpiece of the map is indestructible. In Belonging Again, we'll talk about the sociological condition as confusion's masterpiece from Macbeth. Well, there's something about the conspiracy which is enjoyment's masterpiece, because the incompletion is part of the structure. So it never has to. So the fact that it is incomplete does not disappoint point. It's what you expect. And so it's blatant, it's vivid, and thus it cannot lead to the same. Like, if you accept a conspiracy, almost by definition, you've integrated with lack in a way, but it's a perversion. It's the privation of the integration of lack, where you accept lack as fundamental. In this way, you accept a accidental lack as fundamental or essential, to use Aristotelian terms. And that little reversal right there is extremely consequential, because it's a false integration of lack that seems like an integration of lack, but you have not ontologically owned the lack. It is still projected outside of you, but it's projected outside of you in a manner that it is always outside of you, and thus always an obstacle to desire that maintains the fantasy and enjoyment. That's why it is so devious. So another way to put it is that the lack of a conspiracy is always about to be solved, but you come to enjoy never actually finishing that always aboutness. The always aboutness is always there, but it creates this feeling that it's always about to be uncovered, and you come to enjoy always being about to uncover, but never actually uncovering it. So there's a complicated kind of move there that goes on, but it's really important. Whereas true integration with lack is where you understand lack can never go away. It is part of the very ontological structure, and so it's never always about to be fulfilled. It's always there. Which is then a funny Hegelian move. If the lack is part of the structure, then it's not really a lack, it's incompleteness with the in parentheses. So you come to find completion in the incompleteness. But this is what's so strange. It's so similar. That true integration with lack is so similar to the conspiracy. Because the conspiracy is a state where the incompletion never goes away, but it's completeness in incompleteness without the parentheses. While true integration with lack is completeness in incompleteness with the in parentheses. And that super subtle move that is huge. And the fact that desire has been able to create this idol, IDOL, this idol of the truth almost, that is so similar, is why conspiracy is such a threat. The difference is subtle. It's like in Christianity, where the devil is the highest angel fallen. He's an angel, but he's fallen. So, like, true evil and true good are very, very similar. So, like, the function of lack is ontological versus the function of lack is purely epistemological in a conspiracy is very similar, but the difference is massive. And that's why the conspiracy is so important to understand, and why Mr. Coates' work here is so important. So another way to put it is that the conspiracy is a epistemological incompleteness that finds completeness in that incompleteness, whereas true integration with lack, which I think would be getting into absolute knowing in Hegel, is a completeness in incompleteness with the in parentheses that is onto-epistemological. But this epistemological trick of the conspiracy, that works because it is able to give desire an eternal fantasy, is so dangerous because it is so similar to the onto-epistemological lack. And this is also where the end of the paper is going to talk about how deception, conspiracy, capital D deception, is the privation of absolute knowing. They have a very similar structure, and that's one of the reasons why deception exists, is precisely because the world is AB, as I like to put it, is ontologically incomplete with the in parentheses. That is precisely why absolute knowing is the case, but that's also precisely why deception can be so dangerous and is such a risk. And, Mr. Hunter also has this great line where he says, conspiracy relies on an ever-encompassing other, but is also paradoxically situated as an other which questions the nature of the other. So the person in a conspiracy presents themselves to themselves as someone who questions, who's after the truth, right? And so the idea to them that they would be actually maintaining a falsity to maintain an ever-fantasy seems completely absurd, because, the whole reason they've given up so much for the conspiracy is because they care about the truth, right? So the whole idea that the structure of conspiracy is to keep them from the truth precisely to maintain fantasy would seem absurd. This is why it's such a masterpiece of desire, because the very thought that it is a deception is in of itself precisely absurd to you, because you're in the deception precisely because you're someone who doesn't want to be perceived, who doesn't want to be deceived. So it's extremely devious. So again, a conspiracy is a masterpiece of deception, capital D, that you are in precisely because you're someone who's trying to get to the truth and overcome deception. So then the idea that you are being deceived would be totally absurd to you, and thus we have the masterpiece of desire, the masterpiece of enjoyment, because the desire has an ever fantasy. It's truly hermetically sealed. This also brings to mind, Zizek is famous for incorporating Jaissance and Lacan into the structure of ideology. Mikey at Theory Underground has done amazing work on that. And basically, I think we can see Mr. Coates as bringing conspiracy and Jaissance and Lacan together, which, I think you can do both because conspiracy has the same structure of ideology. All ideologies, all of them are internally consistent systems. That's what I like to call them. Worldviews, truth, conspiracy, all of these things are, in essence, an internally consistent system. And I think actually defining like ideology, conspiracy, the problem with this language is it can be descriptions that make it seem as if they're different in structure, like truth and ideology are different in structure when they're not. They're all coherent. Now they may not correspond, but of course, how do you tell correspondence, right? That's the great Hegelian move, right? You can't. And so what does it mean that then you have to think anew relative to absolute knowing, the inability to ever be certain of correspondence. And that's your correspondence. Now that gets us into the whole absolute choice book. That's an entirely different manner. But the main point is that ideology, worldview, truth, philosophy, they're all internally consistent systems. And so what Zizek has done for ideology and bringing in Lacan, I think we see Mr. Coates doing with conspiracy, which I think is really, really important. Now, bringing in some Hegel and Kant, I think they're in the same way, like for Kant, you cannot get to the thing of itself. There's actually an enjoyment in not getting to the thing of itself. This is the other key move here. Like, we enjoy the fact we can't get to the thing of itself because that means we can always fantasize what things actually are, right? Like, if we could reach things in of themselves, that would not be something desire wanted. So, the belief of the noumenon is another masterpiece of desire, frankly. Now, that's why I think Hegel, maybe we don't like Hegel, because Hegel's like, the limitation is something you reach, and that itself is the incorporation of thought, and desire's like, screw that, because then you're responsible for that limit, as opposed to desire using the limit to maintain an ever fantasy. Hegel reverses that, so maybe that's a reason we hate Hegel, right? Whereas Kant is something perhaps more desirable, precisely because he provides a noumenon that gives us an ever fantasy. In certain readings of Kant, I always have to make this distinction. There are other thinkers who disagree with this reading of Kant, but this is the popular reading of Kant and has freaking influenced the world, so we have to take it seriously. So the noumenon is a masterpiece of desire because it maintains an ever fantasy. Likewise, the conspiracy is a masterpiece of desire. The noumenon and the conspiracy have they're very similar. So I think we could see a way in which Kant is something desire may like more than Hegel. There's a way in which in Kant the limitation that lets desire ever create a fantasy is not something we are responsible for, and so we're not responsible for our fantasies while we enjoy them. And we also we like being controlled. That's kind of Girardian, right? Where the sadomasochist, there's an enjoyment we get from being controlled, from being controlled over. And, for Girard, we balance that with mimetic rivalry and all that other stuff. But there's a notion which we can find enjoyment in being controlled. So there is a way in which in Kant, we can have fantasy without being responsible for that fantasy, and so the fantasy having control over us in a way, and we can find enjoyment in that. And again, to understand all this, you need Lacan. This is why Lacan is so important, and Mr. Coates has done such an important work here. Whereas in Hegel, if the limit is something that is within the phenomenon, if the noumenon is part of the phenomenon, then we are responsible for our limit, thus responsible for our fantasy, and we don't want to be responsible for our fantasy. We want to enjoy our fantasy without being responsible for it. And integrating with Lacan in a true sense would require responsibility for our fantasies, and we don't want that, because we don't want to be seen as someone who fantasizes. That can be seen, there's a lack of nobility in that, a lack of honor, and so on and so on. And then, of course, this brings us to all the ways that capitalism, and Mr. Coates touches on this. He says there's an unholy alliance between conspiracy and capitalism today, which is a great line. There are ways in which capitalism today operates in order to make us feel like we are not in control, and thus we can fantasize without being responsible for our fantasies. And then there are ways in which, frankly, capitalism likes conspiracies. I think in the paper we'll talk about how, basically the January 6th insurrection in some ways can be seen as a wonderful benefit to capitalism and the state, because if you oppose the state now or the system, you can be seen as one of these crazy QAnon people. And so you don't want to be one of them, so you wouldn't oppose the state. Or you would be more hesitant to oppose the state, because what if you're one of the QAnon people? So there's this funny way in which deception either gets people, it satisfies people in capitalism because they feel like they have secret knowledge and thus they're satisfied and they're not anxious. They don't have the same alienation and thus they're a good capitalist because they know the secret truth as they go about their day and they're 9 to 5. Or deception benefits capitalism because the people of a QAnon rise up against the system, and they're probably going to be a minority precisely because it's a conspiracy, and a conspiracy really only has power if not everyone believes it. It has to be that small secret group with secret knowledge. Well, they're probably going to fail. They're not going to overturn the US government. And then people not wanting to be seen as part of that, who don't follow the deception of the conspiracy, then won't rebel against the state. And so you see how conspiratorial thinking can benefit the system. It seems like it doesn't because it's opposed to the system. It's talking about the system being evil, but the system loves to be seen by evil in a manner that then makes it seem absurd to believe the system is evil, because then you're not going to think the system is evil. You see all these complicated moves. Now, coming to the close, and again, I highly suggest the book. Again, it is called Conspiracy and the Subject by Hunter Coates. Check out Dissatisfied Philosophy. And he has a lot of impressive videos as well. That review of the science of logic, I think, is a wonderful 15 minutes. In 15 minutes is a wonderful structure that if you knew before you read the book would help you absorb the book. So I really like his work, and he has a bunch of videos on a bunch of different topics that are very well done. But it's interesting to me because it's interesting to me to think that that actually all phenomenon, the way we experience the world, actually in of itself structurally lends us in the direction of conspiracy. And what I mean by that is Mr. Coates, he writes in his book talking about Hegel, and there's this problem because there really are not things, right, in Hegel. There's this weird thing where if you say a tree, and this is the example Mr. Coates uses, if you say a tree is a collection of properties, brown, green, bark, wood, etc., so forth, like a tree is these properties. Well, there's a contradiction there because you can't say a tree is those properties. You can only see the properties are the properties. Well, then what in the world is holding them together? Like, this is the move. Like, you can't say a thing is made of parts because then there is no thing. But then, of course, the parts are not parts. So what are we even talking about? There's this weird thing going on that's very hard to explain. And what a way to put it is like it's like a negativity holding it together. What Mr. Coates what he writes is he says, in this sense, the tree is a jumble of opposing properties: shape of the leaves, the color brown, the color green. Yet somehow it stays composed and together. This somehow is the point we have arrived at, since the medium of the tree is not a property but still an existing aspect of the tree. So what is it that holds all the properties of the tree as an also ? So here's the thing: it seems absurd to say there is no such thing as a tree. And yet you can't say the tree is what the properties is. So there is something that is a tree, but it's not those properties, and the properties are not those tree, and yet they hold together all together as that strange negativity. This is what's so weird, and it is difficult to get. Like, it makes no sense to say that there's no such thing as a tree, and yet there is no such thing as a tree. This is the weirdness. Like, so you have to say the properties are somehow holding together. Like, it's this nominalism realist debate. Are universals real, or are you a nominalist and there are no universals? It seems absurd to say there are no universals because there is a chair. There are chairs participating in chairness, and yet where is chairness? It doesn't seem to be anywhere. Hegel doesn't fit in that debate very easily because he wants to say, indeed, there are no such things as universals. There's just these collections of properties, and yet there is some sort of negativity that functions as a universal. So it's a kind of, lack is realism lack almost. Nominalism is where you don't believe in universals. Realism is where you do, and Hegel almost seems to be suggesting that this negativity is real. The negativity is real, so universals are negativity. So here it's almost like you're talking about negative realism or lack realism. Then there's that paper I did with, that work with Mr. Jochen on lacks or not nothing. So maybe it's the term lack, which then would tie Hegel and Lacan, as we know Zizek likes to do, and I think is an important move. So, things are themselves because of some sort of negativity. And they somehow hold together. Well, this is like conspiracy, like QAnon. Like, somehow QAnon holds together with all the ideas, the images, the symbols, the plots, the celebrities, the pizza parlors, the crimes. Like, it all holds together. It stays composed and together. And like deception with the capital D works because you can always have it's an unbound also, like an unbound Prometheus. You can always add to it in the same way that the tree can always add properties and maintain its negativity. It can change color in the fall. Green leaves can become red leaves and it's still a tree. It can have bark, or maybe it doesn't have as much bark. There are different sizes, there are different heights. Dogwoods is different from a redwood. And so there's always a great also that a tree can be and still be itself and yet not the same. It's very strange, this negativity. Well, likewise, conspiracies can morph and change and yet maintain themselves. QAnon can take on a million different forms and still be around. And so the very structure of things seems to be isomorphic or similar to the structure of conspiracies. And so the very nature of reality. So in a weird way, conspiracies are a revelation of the true ontology, like the true ontological structure. Like conspiracies, the very existence of conspiracies is a testament to absolute knowing. It's a testament to Hegel. It suggests that Hegel is right. Like the very existence of conspiracies, they're not an outlier. We treat conspiracies as if they're an outlier, like something that should be ignored. They're really revelations of the truth of reality. In the same way that like Michael Levin was talking with Vervaeke and I guess Wolfgang Smith and all those people at the Meaning Code, and they were saying that the placebo, in medicine, people treat the placebo effect as an outlier, as something on the outside that we shouldn't pay attention to. When they were saying, no, they should make it central because it's a revelation of the truth of how the body heals itself. Well, likewise, a conspiracy is a revelation of the actual ontological structure of reality. The very fact that we can epistemologically generate a conspiracy would suggest, and since ontology and epistemology are actually always connected, if we can epistemologically generate a conspiracy, this would suggest that the fabric of reality is such where you can generate a conspiracy, and that would require the fabric of reality to be Hegelian, AB, the language I used to use, or absolute knowing, paradoxical, contradiction, Todd McGowan. We can use different languages. So the existence of the conspiracy is a testament to the nature of reality. But we don't tend to get that because we bracket the conspiracy out as irrelevant. And I think it's a massive, absurd. We bracket the conspiracy out as absurd, and therefore the conspiracy does not function as a revelation of worldviews, how they are in their structure, which would then be a revelation of how the world that we view is, which causes all sorts of trouble, because we don't get that difference, and that leads to the problem of ideology and all this other stuff. In the same way that for Dr. McGowan, like bracketing the contradiction out is what leads us to problematic ideas of rationality, and I would say autonomous rationality, which gives us a totalitarianism and all that. So likewise for Hegel, you make the contradiction central to your thinking, not bracket out as an anatomy of reason or whatever. I can't say that word. From Kant, like Kant does, he brackets out the contradiction. For Hegel, he makes it central. Likewise, we need to stop bracketing the conspiracy out as beside the point to the question of worldview and ideology and thinking in general, the structure of thinking itself, and make it central. We need to make the conspiracy central to how we think about thinking, and that's where you're going to get into understandings of the map is indestructible. And once you get that, then you can get absolute knowing of Hegel, absolute skepticism of Hume, and that can lead you into integration with Lacan in a true sense, which can give you, I think, the revival of philosophy, frankly, in the new philosophy that we need, that would lead us into becoming Nietzschean children, that we basically need to avoid things like the meta crisis of Daniel Schleiermacher, the meaning crisis, etc., etc. So maybe we can put it this way. As Hegel makes the contradiction central for thinking, we need to make the conspiracy central for worldview or philosophy or politics. We need to stop bracketing out the contradiction. Likewise, we need to stop bracketing out the conspiracy. And what Mr. Coates has done is helped us think the conspiracy in terms of desire and Lacan, which I just think is utterly invaluable. Now, the final point of the paper is, Mr. Coates, who, again, I'm just very impressed with all of the threads he ties together in his book. He tells us that absolute knowing recognizes 3 points in Hegel: the inability or limitation of seeing the world as whole or in itself. Second, the inability to see beyond the now, and then the inability to see beyond the immediacy and self-consciousness of the I. Now, this is a Zizekian interpretation of absolute knowing, which I am very, I myself align with, I like very much, even if there are disagreements of that on what absolute knowing is and so on and so forth. And Mr. Chad Haig has a take on absolute knowing on his channel that's quite good. Then, of course, you have the great Dr. Holgate, so on and so forth. But anyway, I do think absolute knowing, because you'll even see in Westphal Meltro's, his book, The Truth of History and Hegel, which there's that paper on we did, he'll talk about absolute knowing as a recognition of limitation. So I think these understandings of it as the inability or limitation of seeing the world as the whole in itself, to see beyond the now, and so on, and that's all quite valid. All of that would work for a description of conspiracy. This is exactly what conspiracy does, or capital D deception. You don't see the whole. It always keeps you from seeing the whole. You can't see beyond the now, the information the deep state is giving you, and the inability to see beyond the immediacy of your own self-consciousness or what the media is giving you, right? The media system is giving you your immediacy. You can't see beyond this moment in history that the state is giving you. So the structure of absolute knowing is isomorphic to the structure of the conspiracy. And basically what I want to argue is that the conspiracy, or capital D deception, is a privation of absolute knowing. In Christianity, gluttony, food is not evil, but gluttony is, sin, right? Like St. Augustine tells us that sin is a disordered good because sin has no substance. It's not a thing in of itself. It is an absence of a good. So to put this another way, there's nothing wrong with sex, but there's something wrong with lust because it's a disordered relationship to sex. Likewise, there's something wrong with food, but there's a problem with gluttony because it's a disordered relationship with food, right? So the issue is conspiracy or deception arises from a disordered relationship with the world, which is AB. We arise to conspiracy because it is a disordered relationship with the world. When a rightly ordered relationship with the world would be absolute knowing. So the conspiracy is the privation of absolute knowing. And failure to understand that arises where we have kind of a shadow version, if you will, a kind of mirror inverse of absolute knowing in the form of conspiracy, where we always live with lack, but this lack is something outside of us. It's accidental, but it's always there. It's this, like I was saying earlier, the difference, this very subtle difference. In the conspiracy, the incompleteness is external to us, but it's always there, so it seems like we're integrated with the lack because it's always there, but it's always there about to be completed, but never is, and we find enjoyment in that. Where in absolute knowing, the lack is ontological, it is part of us, and so it's always there, not because it's always about to be completed, because it's always not going to be completed, it's always going to be a lack, and we actually find completeness in that incompleteness, and thus we have ion in parentheses because there's a negation sublation that occurs there. Where in the conspiracy, there is no negation sublation because there is no substance to sublate. And Mr. Coates makes this point at one point. There's no substance to sublate. And yet it's always about to be sublated. That's why it's so devious. So the conspiracy is the masterpiece of desire, and it's kind of the masterpiece as a privation of absolute knowing. It is truly devious, and it is truly a great risk to fall into. But thanks to the work of Mr. Hunter Coates, we have a great resource to help us avoid this masterpiece of desire, to help us avoid it, and to not fall into something like QAnon that would lead to self-effacement and into great problematics. And so I am grateful for Mr. Hunter Coates to write this book, and you can purchase it on Amazon. Please check out his YouTube page, Dissatisfied Philosophy, and thank you so much for your time.